All right. So here we go, and we are ready for our Unit 9 weekly lecture. So, what I want to do here is talk about the formation of the land ethic as laid out by Aldo Leopold and go through and I want to go into a little micro study in game management and how the land ethic is this really big, complex, philosophical, ethical framework that Aldo Leopold is going to spend his entire lifetime um, as a forester and someone who's moving around the entire North American continent, trying to understand how different ecosystems work together. He's originally going to start his education, as I'm sure some of you picked up, in a school of agriculture, because this time we didn't have um, forestry and wildlife studies as their own entity. They were all within usually agricultural departments nationally. So what starts to happen is that this study of ecology starts to emerge, and ecology starts to gain its own influence as an independent study. And when this starts to occur, some complex questions start to come into this discipline, and this is going to be in the early 1900s and through kind of the mid 1900s. There's going to be some ethical discussions that start to pop up regarding how land use and how natural resources are being used. And the largest question that's going to come out of this, at least that Leopold is going to continually ask himself throughout his life, is that what is humanity's ethical responsibility to the biotic community? And in many cases, early on in human history, a lot of folks, I think, would say, well, there really isn't one. It's, survival of the fittest. It's a very this Darwinian approach. And that worked fine until the industrial era. And people began to harness much greater technological leverage than they had before. And once they started, as we know, with the Enlightenment, and once the ability to quite drastically impact an environment, a natural environment, became very feasible by modern humanity at the time. People start to ask, is this the right thing to do? Are we acting ethically when we do those things? And so what I want to go into here is, and Leopold has lots of big questions in St. County Almanac and his game management books and everything else, but I want to look strictly at game management for a moment because I think it illustrates this topic pretty well through pictures. So let's go on here and let's talk about market hunting. And I don't know how many of you know the history of market hunting or just a little bit about it, but from the mid to the late 1800s, even in some of it occurring in the earlier 1800s, but there was massive market hunting across North America. And I'm going to go through, and if you look at birds, we know there's extinction level events occurring for birds because these market hunters, would move into an area. They'd set up, these were referred to as punt guns. This is a punt gun here, and these punt guns could at times kill up to 100 birds with a single shot. And they'd paddle across these lakes and these low boats very slowly, come up on a flock of birds and pull the trigger, and then run around or float around and pick up all the birds. And with just a few shots, you could harvest hundreds and hundreds of birds. And at the time, nobody was really asking the question, is this sustainable? Can we continue to do this? Those questions, there's a wild abundance of wildlife throughout North America. And this seemed like a logical, economically intelligent thing to go about doing. And there really weren't ethical questions about land use being contemplated by the general public. Here we see we ship deer and all of these bucks. I mean, just massive amounts of deer being harvested in a region, loaded onto these carts and then carted away. Oh, and here's a couple of more of those punt guns. getting back to the punt guns for a moment, these guns would usually require two men to shoot if they weren't mounted within a boat or on a tripod, and often they were used in boats. But one person would have to stand in the front and hold the gun up while the other person, obviously work the cocking action, the action of the gun and the trigger. So down here, this is another one. These are all buffalo skulls, and you can see the mountain. I mean, just mountain of buffalo. This guy's holding one up right here. Just mountain of buffalo skulls. And again, these were market hunts. Oftentimes, just for the hide, the meat would be left out on the prairie to rot. And in the matter of, oh gosh, 40 years, 30 years, maybe even less, it was believed that the herds of buffalo in the American West were somewhere around 60 million, and we hunted those buffalo down to a level where there were, I believe, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but there were somewhere in the a few hundred. I know at one point the herd that was here in Kalispell, that the Conrad family in Buffalo Hills out here towards Kyla, that the Conrad family helped manage. I believe it's that herd that ended up in Central Park. And so, we watched that Olmsted documentary earlier about Central Park. And Central Park actually housed some of the only buffalo left in the entire North American continent. And North America is the only continent where buffalo naturally exist. So it took a very short period of time for industrialized humanity to wipe out 60 million of the largest creatures in all of North America. We were becoming quite potent at the time. Some of those herds of buffalo, I read this book. I can't recall the title of it right now about buffalo, but reports, you always have to take these reports with a grain of salt, but that the buffalo herds would sometimes be 20 miles wide and 50 miles long as they were moving north and south in their migration patterns. So needless to say, the hit that wildlife encountered was dramatic. If we then apply this to the ideas of ecology that we are starting to understand through the crash course lessons that we've been watching, is that when you take one particular species within an ecological zone or region, and you start to dramatically impact the numbers of that particular species, you inadvertently impact all sorts of other ecological balances within that ecosystem. And those impacts have all sorts of fairly wide-ranging effects, particularly on biological diversity, but also on just basic ecosystem functioning. And once you start to have too many of those, ecosystems start to collapse. And Aldo Leopold, as he was moving around the country with this background in the beginnings of ecology, in agronomy, and in agriculture, he was starting to see that as these ecosystems would break down, there were mass impacts on watersheds and water quality, on soil fertility, all of things which are, of utmost importance to agriculturalists. And he started to say, and he obviously had spent a long time in the outdoors and was an avid hunter and sportsman. And he started to ask, is what we are doing right? And he started to think maybe in some cases we could do a better job of land stewardship. And so this is where we get his desire to change people's attitudes towards the land. So he wants to take, and I'm just using those market hunters as an example, but the market hunting attitude, or the anthropocentric human first attitude, and say, well, let's relook at this. Let's try to reshape how we use our land. And so early on, as a younger man, he thought that he was friends with, over the course of his earlier life, he was friends with Teddy Roosevelt. As you know, Teddy Roosevelt was also a huge sportsman and saw the dwindling of these large North American game species. antelope, buffalo, in some places, many places, elk, even deer were starting to be hit, turkeys, and all sorts of different wild game birds. And so the first route that Aldo Leopold advocated for was that we needed more regulation. And as we know, typically, especially with Americans, notions of independence are romantic, rugged individualism. Typically, top down government regulation starts to run into some ideological issues with a lot of American core values. And so he took a step back, and he was a very he wasn't Aldo Leopold. One thing, he had a pretty strong belief in what an ethical interaction with the land looked like, but at the same time, he was not a dominant personality. He was, by all accounts, he was very kind and very gentle and very thoughtful. And so he took a step back and he said, okay, regulation probably isn't going to be, because he just saw it, fail. He said it's not going to be the most effective way to go about this. So let's take a step back and think about what does work. And so what he ended up coming up with is that communicating these ideas, these ecological, these scientifically proven or slowly starting to be proven ecological concepts, along with government subsidies, meaning, paying farmers in particular. One thing to note here is that, oh, he was very interested in terms of private land holdings. And this is just a conversation we need to kind of diverge here for a moment. And obviously, in the American West, there is a ton of public land. I mean, we look at the Flathead Valley, we look at our region here in Montana, and we are inundated with public land. Everywhere you turn, you can find land that you are allowed to go onto and to access. Back east, even in the Midwest, there is not much public land. And it comes down to, conservation and land stewardship really comes down to what is the private owner, how are they going to manage and their land. And this is where he thought these attitudes about land, what decision does a farmer or a forest owner, what kind of decisions do they make? And the culmination of all of those people making lots of decisions is what impacts these ecosystems. Because we didn't read this, but as Thoreau will talk about, and Emerson both. Emerson has a great quote about it also. Emerson one day went up and looked out over the land, and he said, standing up on the land, up on this bluff overlooking all of these farms, he said, you couldn't tell where one owner's land started and one ended. In the next, where all of these artificial human boundaries, property boundaries by, if we really look at them, are completely human created ideas. And, a deer doesn't care unless there's a fence, or an elk doesn't care unless there's a fence. They could care less. They never even understand these things. And so ecosystems span, obviously, lots of private ownership across the natural environment. And so Aldo Leopold was interested in what can he do to positively impact how a private owner chooses to manage their own land. And so one thing that he developed was that communication and government subsidies. And so government subsidies, in this case, we have them around here. I know a few years ago, I applied for a fire suppression, where I got X amount of dollars per acre to make sure that I had to meet the specs of, wildland fire, scientific specs of ladder fuels and tree spacing and those sorts of things to create a healthier forest. And then I was able to do some of the work myself and get paid, and then pay some loggers to come in and do some of the thinning mechanically for me. And so in the end, I didn't make a whole lot of money, but I, had some of my labor paid for, and I was able to pay for that. And now there's, I have fire suppressions around my house, which they say at house and driveway and those sorts of things, which is much cheaper than potentially having to fight a forest fire. And if they get lots of different chunks of that fire suppression strategies employed, then it's much less likely. I live out here west of Kalispell, out towards Kyla. It's much less likely that a forest fire would rip through all the homes out here. So, using small government subsidies, communicating ecological principles, and he found that this was a win, and that this was actually getting people to change their not necessarily their ethic or their attitude towards the land, but to change some of their practices. And as they started to change some of their practices, what they found was that this was a big win for wildlife, particularly large game species. And so, for any of you who have watched any hunting videos, I'm a pretty avid hunter. I love hunting. If you've watched any hunting videos around the country, many places people put in food plots and people put in all sorts of needs for whatever game they happen to be hunting, planting certain crops, thinning forest in a particular way to promote the growth and the success of a particular species that they seek to go hunt. And so this works. Leopold was one of the early adopters of this. And truly, Leopold is responsible for large-scale science-based game management. This is where we get these complex ideas about how the science of ecology can be utilized for this purpose. It also creates this notion of wildlife conservation, because as these people are seeking to collect these government subsidies, maybe start to manage game a little bit more carefully, we get this whole idea of wildlife conservation. And wildlife conservation, and there's a lot of discussion what's conservation and what's environmentalism, and really it comes down to a debate over words in a lot of cases, but there can be some differences. Sometimes folks will say conservation is to conserve something for later use or very measured use, where environmentalism is the idea of the environment just for the sake of the environment. No human utility needed whatsoever. If we were to look at Aldo Leopold and try to understand him, I would say he was both an environmentalist and a conservationist. Neither of those terms were used at that time. Conservation was starting to come on the scene and would be kind of the first generation of a more the land ethic, a more nature-focused land ethic. But Leopold, one of these quotes that I pulled from one of these documentaries that I thought was really kind of summed up the industrial era and the influences, that he often thought and often mused that our tools grow faster than we do, meaning that, we get these large punt guns and we get railroads to hunt buffalo and we get all of these things. We're like, oh, let's go use them. We could even argue about that in the internet and our cell phones today. We don't necessarily think of the consequences of our use of these things. We rush into the new tool and the capability that the new tool gives us, but it doesn't mean that we as a species have grown ethically or morally with the tools that we are readily adapting and very rapidly adopting. So great quote here. So moving on to this game management. So, and I sort of just discussed this, but positively manipulating habitat can greatly increase wildlife numbers. It worked. The science is there. It's beyond question. It's not at this point. It's not a environmental debate. We know that if you put certain things within your local ecology, that certain species will thrive, if more so than if those particular elements are absent. And so Leopold really started to solidify this idea that how private landowners use the land is the most impactful influence on wildlife habitat. Now, I don't think that's necessarily applicable here in the Flathead Valley in Montana, but if you live in an area or a part of the country that much of the land is held, or a majority of the land is held in private ownership, then this becomes even more the case. Obviously here we debate about the use of public lands far more than people maybe in a more Eastern or Midwestern sense. But same concept applies. So, as you all know, so now, as a result of Leopold and many others that followed Leopold, but we now have game management. For those of you, many of you, I'm sure, have looked at these maps over and over, but in Montana, up here, we are in Hunting District Region 1, and then, or Region 1, but then our district, we have different districts down here. And if you look closely, this is Kalispell right here. And um, I believe, oh no, I'm sorry. I'm not looking at this map very well. There's Kalispell right there. And we've got District 120. This is Highway 2 heading out west of town. And then heading north up 93, and then south down around Flathead Lake right here. So we break it up, section based on ecological principles and understanding how species operate within different geographies. 102 has its own rules, 120 has its own rules, 110 has its own rules, and the rules based on how many licenses they give out, how many doe tags, when you can hunt in some cases in some districts. And the general idea is to create a set of human regulated boundaries as to the number of animals in this particular map. It's for deer and elk that we harvest, so as to conserve the deer and elk population, so that we don't run out and shoot all the deer and elk in a particular short period of time, and then we no longer have deer and elk. So that's where that conservation comes from. Many of us, I'm sure, know people who love to hunt, and if given the opportunity, they would go hunting every day. But if too many people did that and it weren't regulated within a particular season, we would soon find that we had no more deer and elk in our region. And so that's why we use modern game management principles, and we can thank Aldo Leopold for the continuation of these species into the conservation of these species into present day. Because if it hadn't been for a change in our ethical approach to land conservation, soil quality, water quality, those sorts of things, I don't think many of us would be hunting today. If we had continued on the path that we were on, our landscape would look dramatically different than it currently does, even here in northwestern Montana. So, clicking along here. So, what is the land ethic? Getting back to kind of the macro scope of what Aldo Leopold is looking at, concerned about. The land ethic is this. He defines it in his own way, but being that kind, gentle person that he always appeared to be in his writing and in his communication, he doesn't exactly come out and tell us precisely what the land ethic is. He gives us hints and his thoughts here and there, but more importantly, his writing and his influence asks a series of has a series of suggestions that one should adopt and consider if they want to foster their own personal land ethic or a more complex land ethic. And these criteria, and these aren't the only criteria, but to kind of sum them up, it's stay curious. And meaning stay curious about the natural world. Go out into it, understand it, watch it, learn about it. Don't have steadfast ideas that this is the way it is and this is the way it's always going to be. And just stay open-minded, stay curious. Remain respectful of natural relationships. This question predicates the idea that you accept that these natural relationships are pretty complex and they're necessary for the functioning of a successful ecology. Try to understand history. Try to incorporate an understanding of history. I think he would argue here that this is both, understanding the physical history of a place, but then also the cultural. When he ends up shooting that wolf pack and shooting those wolf pups and the mom, he's not he's writing about this years later, and he's not begrudging the situation, but he's reflecting upon his own personal culture around hunting that he had at that point, and ecology. And he never thought he hunted throughout his entire life, to the best of my knowledge, from what I've read. So it wasn't that he flipped and said, "Oh no, no, hunting's bad." It's that he just tried to adopt a more complex understanding of the physical, the cultural, the natural relationships. He remained curious, and he he adapted and built upon this ethic about nature that he had. And then the final one, which is more complex, and in some ways, if he is controversial, it's contemplating this concept of justice. And again, here was a place where he had ideas and he had theories and he had concepts, but it was more the question that he asked, is that how do we apply justice to the natural world? What is justice in relationship to an ecosystem or a watershed? How does that work? And that's philosophically, that is a big complex question. So overall, I'd say, if you want to develop an ethical understanding of the natural world, these are definitely helpful signposts to read along your adventure in life. And if you read these signposts in your adventure in life, I think Aldo Leopold can help you learn more about your own land ethic.